Welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam. I'm Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is Who is Lesley Fair? Meet a consumer protection law legend. When we learned that our guest was retiring from her longtime position at the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection, we immediately realized that this was a great opportunity for her to make an encore appearance on Our Curious Amalgam. In the decades since she began her career, today's guest has become a luminary in the consumer protection law community. She is described by her fans as the voice of the FTC, with a unique ability to translate the agency's work into plain English for the public and for business people trying to understand their consumer protection obligations. She is no less famous for the sense of humor that infused her hundreds of live presentations and the articles she wrote and posted on the FTC's must-read business blog. And in addition to her contributions to the evolution of consumer protection law and policy in the U.S. over almost 4 decades, our guest is also a law professor and a leader in the profession who has worked to encourage new lawyers to pursue careers in government service. But before we talk about all that, I'd like to welcome my co-host, Jaclyn Phillips. Hi, Jaclyn.
Hey, Alicia.
Would you like to introduce our guest and kick off the conversation?
You may have already guessed. Our guest today is Lesley Fair, and her name may be one you know from her 37 years at the Federal Trade Commission, including 14 of those heading the FTC's one-of-a-kind, informative, and fun-to-read business blog. Lesley joins us today, having retired from her illustrious career at the FTC in September 2024. At the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, Lesley was a senior attorney where she was a litigator in the Division of Advertising Practices for over 2 decades, and then specialized in industry education. You may also be a former or current student of Lesley's through Catholic University or George Washington University. You may also be familiar with her from the early days of OCA when she was a guest on episode number 28 called Why All Is Not Fair, 4 Tips of Complying with Established FTC Advertising Principles. And if not, today is a great day to catch up. Lesley, we are so excited to have you here and get to know more about your incredible impact on the world of consumer protection.
Thank you, Jaclyn, because I am such a big fan of Our Curious Amalgam. I listen to every episode. My hope is that this one will be like Godfather 2. The sequel will be better than the original.
I think we'll achieve it. So Alicia mentioned your career in government service. So when you were in college and law school, did you know you wanted to work in the public sector?
Yes, I'm an Army brat. I grew up in one of those 12 schools in 12 years kind of families. My dad was a 35-year veteran of the United States Army. My mom, in the middle of her freshman year in college, the day after Pearl Harbor, was on a train back to Washington, D.C. to help the war effort. So I was raised to believe that there was no higher calling than public service. I initially thought of a military career. My father said, we do not want you carrying a firearm. So he said, carry a briefcase instead. And that's how I became a consumer protection lawyer.
That is awesome. And thank you all for your service. So you knew you had a calling, right, to public service. Why the FTC? What led you there?
I had grown up on Army posts. I had seen, 18-year-olds who are, getting their first paycheck that were being ripped off with, 350% annual percentage rate car loans for a Trans Am, or seeing military families evicted or charged unfair rates when they had to leave a lease because the military had called them elsewhere. And so I saw time after time again the way this particularly vulnerable group of American consumers that I think deserves the highest protection under the law was being ripped off left and right. So I always knew I wanted to do that. I worked at the state headquarters for the legal services programs in Texas all throughout law school, so I got interested in that. I then moved to Georgetown, where I was a fellow at the Appellate Litigation Clinical Program. I thought I was going to be a criminal defense appellate lawyer for a while, and I really enjoyed that experience. Not to put too fine a point about it, but Georgetown, yes, it was in the 80s, but Georgetown paid us, not to brag, in the high four figures in our annual salary. And so I am the only one I know who came to the FTC to triple my salary. But I've loved it from the day I walked in the door and the day I left with a tear in my eye. It has been a career that I could only wish other people would understand what joy and satisfaction it's brought me. Now, can you give us just a 3 or 4 minute tour of what you actually did during all of your time there? How did you start out? And we know you were the author of the business blog. When did that get going? The business blog was kind of the second chapter of my FTC career. I started litigating false advertising cases. I brought the FTC's gall darn it second internet case, not the first, the second. But most of the cases I worked on throughout the late 80s and early 90s dealt with deceptive claims for food. I worked on a First Amendment case dealing with the commercial speech doctrine and tobacco advertising. So I worked on a lot of those cases. I worked on infomercial cases. I was the office night owl, so I was the one watching TV at 1:30 in the morning back then. So it was a very broad range of cases dealing both with major national advertisers, Fortune 500 corporations, plus some of the sketchier outfits around that were ripping off consumers. And so I started doing that. I did a lot of litigation, both in United States District Court and in front of the FTC administrative law judges. I've told the story regularly. The first time I represented the FTC in district court, the court clerk called the judge in, cried the judge in, "All rise, please," and hearing the judge say, "Who represents the United States?" And I literally turned and looked to my left and right to see who that person might be, until it dawned on me, oh my gosh, he's talking about me. I really felt both the pressure and the privilege of representing the agency and America's consumers in these cases. So that's what I did, for the first 20 years or so. Then I switched over to a job that I called Carpe Podium. My job was to speak to every Chamber of Commerce, Bar Association, Trade Association, Cub Scout troop, whoever, had ears to hear, to let them know that as far as the FTC is concerned, truth in advertising, honoring consumers' privacy promises, that's not just the law, it's also good business. And I think that was my job for the second half of my career. And that's when the business blog started, under former bureau director David Vladeck, who once said to me, the day somebody says this is a good government blog is the day you lose your job. He says, I want people saying, I can't believe the government is talking like this. And I've tried in 14 years to live up to what David Vladeck required of us. Yeah, there's no question you are probably, I'm going to say, the most engaging government bureaucrat. I'll take that. Thank you. Well, I've met a lot of more engaging ones, but as I said, your claim probably is unsubstantiated, Alicia, but, I'm a civilian now, so what can I do? What do you see as the biggest differences between the types of consumer protection matters the Bureau handled in your beginning years and those that the Bureau has been handling more recently? One of the basic points that antitrust lawyers, consumer protection lawyers, and the American public need to know is that the FTC in about 1979, 1980 had close to 3,000 employees. And the FTC now has more like 1,100 employees. And so think about that. An agency that has become that much smaller, over a course of time, and yet our job has become so much bigger. I saw the very first, beginning of the internet. When I started, it was just TV advertising, radio advertising, magazine, newspaper. And I remember thinking, how in the world are we possibly going to deal with this? And I think especially under the leadership of Jody Bernstein, who was a legend in the consumer protection world. And I think recently in March celebrated one of her birthdays that begins with a 9. She said, listen, this is new. We are going to skate to where the puck will be. And FTC staff, you have an obligation to be ahead of the curve on this. And she really pushed for us to be bringing those cases, dealing with internet. I mean, since then, of course, we've seen mobile commerce. We've seen social media. But here's, I think, where I can point to Congress's genius in 1915. Almost every one of those cases has been brought with a 110-year-old statute. Unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce are hereby declared unlawful. I always tell people, I don't have a tattoo, but if I did, that's what mine would say. Because that really has been, and possibly could remain the foundation, the fundamental of what the FTC does, certainly on the consumer protection side. And so as we see more changes in the marketplace, more changes in technology, I am very proud to have worked, I got to get used to that, to have worked at an agency that has been able to meet every one of the challenges that technology has faced us with over many decades.
So, Lesley, you've already given us a nice precursor to what I think we're curious about next. So you've told us, you have this unique perspective of having practiced at the FTC before the internet and bringing the second internet case. And, many, many years after that, as we've seen the evolution in technology. So do you have any guidance or thoughts on how or if consumer protection law needs to evolve, or kind of otherwise how we deal with emerging technology like AI?
Well, Jaclyn, when it comes to questions of changes to statutes and legislation, things like that, I have always described myself as inside the beltway, but out of the loop. I am not a political person. I tell people my last time I was on Capitol Hill was with my Brownie troop. And I don't mean a Brownie troop I led. I mean a Brownie troop I was a member of. So, what Congress should or shouldn't do, I will leave to Congress. I will make 2 suggestions, though. The first, I think I join every FTC commissioner in saying that I really hope Congress takes a very close look and will very quickly respond to the Supreme Court's decision in AMG that took away, I think, the primary tool the FTC had against false advertising and fraudsters, which is redress under 13B. And I think I am proud to say, I think that's something that needs to be done yesterday. It will take 1 sentence in a statute. This is me talking in my first week of civilian life, so I can say it. What are they going to do to me now? But I think that needs to be done immediately. And that's not just for new technologies, that's for old technologies. I look at cases where the FTC has literally won back billions of dollars for consumers. And remember, every penny of that money goes back to consumers. It does not fund any of the FTC's operating mission. That, I think, needs to be done immediately. When it comes to the 800-pound elephant in everybody's room, AI, I think the FTC, at least in my opinion, is taking a very wise course, as it did at the beginning of the internet, as it did in the beginning of social media. Most folks are aware that the FTC has these national workshops and conferences and accepts public comments. It is the original crowdsourcing that is built into the Administrative Procedures Act and everywhere else. When the FTC says, file your comment, members of the public, they really mean it. They want to hear from businesses, from trade associations. They always hear from the inside the Beltway law firms, and that's great. Those are important people who need to be weighing in. But the FTC also want to hear from consumers. When it comes to something like the Children's Online Privacy Protection Rule, parents, educators, educational psychologists, child development experts, we need to hear from the experts. And what I really like is that the FTC, I think, has always been a thoughtful agency. It does not litigate first and ask questions later. It makes a thoughtful approach tries to do it quickly, of course, but makes a thoughtful approach, will invite public comment, will invite people into the discussion to get the best advice out there, and will then craft policy based on that. When it comes to AI, I think that there's a lot out there that FTC commissioners have said. The FTC has brought has brought probably close to 10 cases that have some relation to artificial intelligence. It is slowly but surely making up that, shall we say, common law of FTC settlements that give guidance and advice to business. And I think it is continuing to doing that. It is committed to doing that. They're dealing with international leaders in this area, dealing with the state AGs in this area, because, we all know this is a problem and a promise of good. And the FTC, I think, can be a particularly useful force in seeing this useful but dangerous technology heading in the right direction. I like to think of these new technologies. I'm kind of a movie buff. I like to think of that old trope in Westerns where the sheriff is standing over a bridge and there's a train with the bad guys on it, and they're going to jump off the bridge to get onto the train. You don't want to jump off the bridge too early because you're going to get run over by the train. You don't want to jump on the bridge too late because the bad guys are going that way. You need to time it perfectly. And I think in the areas like social media, children's advertising, and now artificial intelligence, I like the approach that the FTC is taking, which involves guidance, thought, accepting other people's input and opinions, starting off with some cases, that I think are well chosen, well selected to make it interesting points. But I think the agency with a statute like Section 5 is very well equipped. Should Congress decide that specific legislation is needed, that is, that's up to them. Certainly the state legislatures are very active. Countries all across the world are getting involved. But regardless of what happens in the legislative realm, I do think the FTC is well suited and well placed to play a really important role to protect consumers in this area.
Great to just hear, you have such a view and perspective on all of this from all you've seen. So it's great to hear it firsthand. And you touched on something else that I think would be great to get your perspective on. You mentioned working, with global leaders on AI because that's something that, obviously can't be dealt with domestically. So what has been your experience with respect to globalization on consumer protection and privacy law?
Well, I think the FTC's Office of International Affairs does an amazing job in keeping those lines of dialogue open. And let me make it clear that those lines of dialogue go in both directions. I will have to confess that some of, I think, the most effective business education the FTC has engaged in recent years were taken from ideas that we learned from our law enforcement counterparts around the globe. This is not us telling them. This is us sharing, them sharing with us to try to come up with the best ideas. Stealing is such an unpleasant term, Jaclyn, but I will say, with imitation being the sincerest form of flattery, there's a lot that we have done, that we have learned from countries around the globe, and especially from countries for whom the marketplace is a relatively new idea. I was at the FTC and attended the first meeting between the chair of the Federal Trade Commission and representatives of some of the what were then the Eastern Bloc countries that happened right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and seeing the hunger for marketplaces, for good stuff being honestly advertised with competition in the marketplace. It's, I think, one of the unsung stories of the FTC, especially in the 90s and a few years after that. And that's continued, kind of evangelizing for truth in the marketplace, for consumer protections where they haven't existed, while at the same time, learn what's worked in Africa. What are South American countries doing that really seems to get the job done? What's going on in the EU? what's going on in Asia. We learn so much from our international counterparts. And speaking of learning, a great part of your job has been educating the public about what it is the agency does, its views, important case developments, and the law itself, not just through the business blog, but also the FTC's website has a whole page of consumer-focused guidance written in plain English. Did you have a hand in that as well? The people I work with in the FTC's Division of Consumer and Business Education are the real experts in that. But these are the kinds of things that I share with my own family members. Yeah, I remember one year, maybe they weren't pleased with their holiday gifts, but I remember the year I gave everyone a shredder. Early in, when folks were concerned about identity theft, understanding the importance of things like that. That office also posts regularly about things families should do to protect each other. I'm sure all of us have heard of what sometimes is called the grandparent scam, where someone will falsify the identity of a grandchild and call a grandparent or another relative to say, I'm in prison in Mexico, or I've been in a terrible accident. You need to wire money immediately. That was a scary scam and an all too lucrative scam just several years ago. Add on voice cloning and artificial intelligence, and my mind just is blown at what scammers could do. And I think the FTC's new impersonator rule is a real important step in that way. But I think the consumer education is a critical part of what the FTC does. We don't just talk to antitrust lawyers or privacy lawyers. We talk to our family members. We talk to members of our community. A number of years ago, I did a identity theft prevention program on Sundays and Saturdays at a group of DC synagogues, churches, and mosques. We need to be in the community at the FTC. We need to be talking to people who need that information. And I think the FTC has really been a model in plain language in getting that information to the people who need it. The delivery of the information is important too, or people will just tune out or they won't understand it. And in that vein, looking at the business blog, can you recommend a few classic, very notable posts? Starting in 2010, I wrote about 95% of the business blog posts, of course, with the advice and expertise of the subject matter experts in the area. But my job was to try to say, here's what is kind of going on behind the pleadings, or here is what you as a business person should be taking from this case. So certainly, I think the business blog was useful in getting the message out. I'm thinking of very high-profile cases like the FTC's action against Volkswagen or Facebook or something like that. I think a relatively recent one dealt with one of the FTC's, I think, the first facial recognition case, dealing with a major retailer that was using a facial recognition software supposedly to catch shoplifters and troublemakers. And the FTC's allegation in the case was that the company's software was deficient in a number of ways, including in its ability to differentiate among African American, Asian, Hispanic, and female faces. That case did end in a settlement, but I think posts like that of major lawsuits and law enforcement actions are good ones for folks to read. I would commit to listeners 2 series of posts done by my colleagues. Mike Atlison and Alicia Jolson have done really interesting and thought-provoking pieces within the past year on artificial intelligence. And I think those are very, very useful for people to read. So, even in those cases, I think we try to give a fresh perspective. I tried to limit myself. My personal rule was no 4-syllable words. I think information was the only one I let myself say, to give you sort of the other side of what the business blog was like. The only 2 that I think maybe crept over that line that I hope I knew where it was, I did explain the provisions for employers under the Fair Credit Reporting Act to the tune of the FCRA, to the tune of YMCA. And I also did explain the FTC's case against an anti-lice shampoo for kids by parodying Vanilla Ice's, I called it Lice Lice Baby. So I think the idea is the fact that it's a government blog does not mean it has to be boring. If anything, it's more important that we are speaking colloquially, that we're speaking in the language of marketers and advertisers. Well, we're going to make it easy for listeners. We're putting a link to the business blog on the website for this particular episode, so please go check it out. It'll be there with some other materials, including links to the consumer advice webpage. I know you've been active in other divisions of the American Bar Association, but we here at the Antitrust Law Section have known and loved you for a very, very long time. And there's a reason for that. What have you been working on? I spent about 15 years working with the Consumer Protection Committee, but about 10 years ago, I switched my efforts under the leadership of the phenomenal Bob Langer, who's kind of a legend in the antitrust and consumer protection world. His idea was that the section would sponsor what is called the Janet Steiger Fellowship Program. Janet Steiger was the first woman to serve as chairman of the FTC. I don't think the living chairs would dispute me when I say that from my point of view, she was the best chairman the FTC ever had. And she's walking with giants, the excellent people that I've had the privilege to work for. But what the ABA section of the Antitrust Law Section does here is funds, I think this year, coming up 35 paid fellowships for students to work on consumer protection and antitrust in state AG's offices. We've had more than 575 graduates of the program, alums, if you will. Many of them you will now see in state AG's offices, at the CFPB, in DOJ antitrust, in DOJ civil litigation, at the FTC. About 40% stay in public service, which I think is the greatest tribute that Janet Steiger could possibly have. I kept on my desk for years. I had written a first draft of something for her in 1990, and she sent me a little Post-it note in response that said, "Kudos, kiddo." She was from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. That's how they talk. I kept it and still have it all those many years later. She would be so proud of what they're doing. She would also be so proud of what the Antitrust Law Section is doing in sponsoring this program. They are creating the next generation of antitrust and consumer protection lawyers under Bob's leadership. I mean, all I do is kind of shift them in the right direction, but I think it's something that the section should be really, really proud of. Couldn't have done it without you, and it is a wonderful program. So this kind of brings us to the end of this conversation. I know we could talk all day, but before we let you go, we have a couple of questions we'd like to ask to get to know you a little bit better as a person. And the first one is this. Can you tell us something interesting or unusual about yourself that is outside of your professional life? One little thing that, sort of takes up a lot of my time. I was in the second group of women to attend the University of Notre Dame. When I was there, it was 600 women, 6,000 men, and I have remained a very devoted alum since then. The nickname Fighting Irish was given to our grandparents and great-grandparents, not as a compliment. What I love about sports teams as well as academics there and their leadership in human rights and civil rights is the idea that, they encourage from undergrad on, what would you fight for? And that our obligation as humans, especially as attorneys, is to fight for what we think is right. And if that means I watch 15 hours of college football on a Saturday, I will do that. But I am a big college football fan and basketball fan as a result of that.
What advice do you have for younger lawyers just starting out in their career?
I think one key piece of advice is to buck a trend that happens a lot. There is a lot more lateral movement among law firms, among government agencies, and I get that. I can understand. But there is something, I found a home 37 years ago at the FTC, and for not 1 minute of that time did I wish I were working anywhere else. And so I do think Certainly, there are times if it's not a good fit, move on. But I also suggest powering through those seasons in our lives where maybe the work doesn't seem as interesting or we're not as passionate. I think there is a benefit to institutional memory. I think there is a benefit to, dare I use the phrase, administrative expertise. The Supreme Court, in what it's recently done with Chevron, may disagree with me. I don't wear a black robe. But I think having people who have been at firms or companies or federal agencies who understood things like that. Again, people like Robert Pitofsky, people like William Kovacic, people like Jody Bernstein, people like Tim Norris. I think that long-term perspective is helpful. So that's one thing I suggest is the grass is not always greener elsewhere. And the second thing I would suggest is to get involved wherever you are, especially at government agencies, in non-work related stuff, whether it's cheering our annual charity drive, whether it's doing the fundraiser for the daycare center, whether it's being on the agency softball team. Get to know folks in different shops. And I will give Chair Khan real credit for reminding antitrust lawyers and consumer protection lawyers that we're all on the same side and that we're really protecting consumers in just two different ways. And so I think cross-pollination, even in an office, can be a real helpful thing. So those are the two bits of advice that I give my students, that I gave my younger colleagues at the FTC. They served me well, and they led me to an immensely satisfying career at the FTC.
For which you are now being applauded. Finally, before we end, we're going to play a little game we call The Curious Hat.
And now it's time for The Curious Hat!
The rules of the game are extremely simple. We're going to draw a random surprise question from a virtual hat. So take it away, Jaclyn.
All right. Get ready for this one. What was the last movie you saw, and what did you think about it?
Can I count streaming services, Jaclyn?
Yeah.
I am a huge fan of Slow Horses, which is a magnificent series dealing with, in a lot of ways, a government agency. In this case, MI5 in Britain. But I think it's a really interesting show. Tense stories about international intrigue and espionage, but it's also really funny. The books are great too, but I think that's one thing that I've absolutely loved watching, and I'm saving it for tonight. I save that. That's my Friday night treat, watching an episode of Slow Horses.
Well, I hope you have lots of time to watch lots more interesting things. Thank you, Lesley, and thank you, Jaclyn, for a very interesting conversation. Thank you to listeners, and tune in for next week's Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.